All right, good evening everyone and welcome to this remarkable panel discussion. My name is Jordan O'Reilly. I'm the CEO and the co-founder of an organisation called HireUp, which is an online platform that gives Australians with disability the power to find, hire and manage their very own support workers. And I'm really thrilled to be here this evening to moderate tonight's panel discussion. On behalf of the team at Remarkable, I'd like to officially welcome you to tonight's event. Remarkable is, of course, a division of the Cerebral Palsy Alliance with backing from iCare, Telstra and Microsoft that focuses on a mission of harnessing technology to further the physical and social and economic inclusion of people with disability in Australia. They do that mainly through a leading disability tech accelerator program, which equips early stage startups with seed funding, knowledge, skills and tools needed to become commercially viable businesses that will go on to have outsized positive social impact in our community. In the last 5 years alone, Remarkable has supported more than 32 startups who have collectively served over 40,000 customers and created 500 FTE jobs in our sector. Nearly $1 million has been invested in seed funding in these startups, and collectively they've gone on to raise nearly $25 million in investment and grants, either while in the program or since graduating, which is, of course, really impressive stuff. Tonight, that's a little bit about Remarkable and myself tonight. So before we jump into it, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. For me, that's the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney. And I would like to pay my respects and our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And of course to acknowledge the lands on which our panellists are residing and the lands on which, from which you're joining us today. Tonight, we'd love you to join the conversation. And before I introduce our wonderful panellists, I'd like to let you know how to get involved. You can jump onto the socials on Twitter, Facebook and LinkedIn. We're at Remarkable Tech. That's Remarkable and capital T Tech, and hashtag Remarkable Insights. In terms of Q&A, there's a Q&A function on Zoom this evening. So please do, if you've got questions, please put them in there and we'll allow time at the end to pass some of those questions on to our panellists. Our event this evening has live captioning and our Auslan interpreter is Chelsea Turner. Thank you, Chelsea, for being here with us tonight. We'll also be recording this event and it will be made available later on the Remarkable Tech YouTube channel, so be sure to subscribe there. Closed captioning is also available and you can activate those by clicking on the closed caption icon in the toolbar. So without further ado, let's introduce our panel members for this evening. They are three truly extraordinary people and I'm so honoured to be part of this conversation with them tonight. Each has their own fascinating backgrounds in the disability, the government, the technology and innovation sectors. But I'm going to keep the bios a little bit brief this evening and hopefully let them do most of the talking. But for now, please join me in welcoming our panellists. And panellists, I'm going to get you to say hello as I introduce your name, so you pop up on the screen. First of all, we have Melanie Tran. Mel, hello, good evening.
Hello.
Hello. Mel is a designer, an innovator, an activist and a social entrepreneur. As a board member at Children and Young People Australia. She's a UX design professional and in 2019 was named in the top 100 women of influence by the Australian Financial Review. That's just one of the many international accolades she's won over the last few years. Really excited to have you, Mel. Thank you for being here. Next we have Mari Johnson. Hello, Mari.
Hello, everybody.
Hello. Mari is the CEO of the Centre for Digital Business. She's an accessibility advocate, a global public speaker, and a commentator on artificial intelligence, technology, digital services, e-health, cyber identity, and innovation. Formerly, Mari was the head of the Technology Authority at the National Disability Insurance Agency, and Mari conceived of and led the global co-design effort with people with disability to deliver Nadia, which hopefully we'll hear a little bit about this evening. That was the first AI-powered digital human for service delivery. So welcome, Mari, thank you for being here. And finally, we have Professor Bruce Bonyhady. Bruce is a disability reformer, an economist, and one of the key architects of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. In fact, Bruce is known by many as the father of the NDIS. He was the inaugural chairperson of the NDIA, from 2013 to 2016 and is currently the executive chair of the Melbourne Disability Institute at Melbourne University. Good evening, Bruce.
Hi, Jordan, and hello, everyone. It's terrific to be here.
Fantastic. We're a few minutes in. I've taken 5 minutes already for the intro, so we'll sort of jump straight into it. I find that we seem to spend a lot of time talking about where the NDIS has come from and what's happening sort of on a day-to-day basis, and often for good reason. But tonight I wanted to focus the discussion on the future. Tonight I wanted us to think about the next 10 years. It's 2020. I think we're all looking forward to 2021 already, but as we look forward over the next 10 years to 2030, and I'd really love us to think tonight about this, the remarkable insight that is the theme of tonight's discussion, which is the NDIS, the greatest nation building project on earth. But quickly, where does that idea come from? Well, in 2018, the former Minister for Social Services, the Honourable Dan Tehan MP, gave a speech at a government event entitled The NDIS, the greatest nation building project on earth. And he said that over the next 10 years, we'll be investing $252 billion into the Australian disability sector. He said it's a project that will change the face of Australian society on a level never attempted before in history, a true world first. So to kick us off tonight, I wanted to sort of do a quick fire round in maybe 60 seconds or less to each of the panelists. Do you agree with our remarkable insight tonight? And if not, why not? If yes, why? Mel, I'll throw to you first.
Great question, massive question. I definitely agree. Yes, there definitely has been some teething issues as the NDIS rolled out, but if you were to take a step back and look at the NDIS and the system holistically and compare it to how we are doing in our disabilities sector and ecosystem here in Australia compared to other parts of the world, we are moving at an exceptional pace right now, and we have already seen some changes that have been transforming, and I think that's only just the beginning, which is why it's so exciting.
Fantastic. And Murray, what about you?
Yes, I do agree with this. And it's the greatest nation building project on earth because a nation is made up of its people, all of its people. But this nation building project that we're on needs a bit of a jolt. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. It got this enormous jolt in 2012, 2013 when it started. And looking forward for the next 10 years, it needs another jolt. And that'll have to come from the community, the innovation ecosystem. It's really not something that can come from the agency itself. And, you know, the world is watching, not only because this is such a massive social reform, but because of the innovation this is driving. And so we all know that NDIS has had its challenges within the agency and within the community, but there is such profound opportunities for the next 10 years. So I would say we cannot be limited or deterred by the challenges of today, because tomorrow will come.
I love that, Marion. I'd love to think that that's maybe one of the things we can get into tonight is how do we as a community come together and give it the jolt that it needs to realise its potential. Bruce, what about you? Known as the father of the NDIS, what do you think? Do you recognise that that description of the NDIS?
Look, I do, and I agree with it because we're shifting 0.5% of GDP each year to support some of the most vulnerable people in our community. So over a decade, we're talking about 5% of GDP. So there's never been such a massive reform anywhere in the world. And unlike physical infrastructure, where we've seen major projects, not only internationally, but in Australia with, for example, the Snowy Mountain scheme, here we're trying to build a scheme, build infrastructure to support 500,000 people with all their individual needs. And it's in that sense that I think this is both the greatest and the most complex reform we've seen. But with it comes this extraordinary opportunity for everyone and for all Australians, that knowledge that if they need this scheme for themselves or their children or their grandchildren, it'll be there to support them. So it is nation building, it's changing the nation. We're just in a very different place to where we were 7 years ago, and in 10 years' time, we'll be in an even better place.
Fantastic. And to throw it to the panel, and Mel, I might come back to you. Do you think, given what Bruce has said there about just the enormity of it, and you think about 5% of GDP over the next decade, Mel, do you think we do a good enough job at sharing the story? Do you think we do a good enough job at taking everyone along with us in terms of this incredible reform that we, as all Australians, should be very proud of?
I think we have, but we should do better. And there's certainly opportunities to do better, whether it's as individuals, as organizations, as leaders. There's always an opportunity to do better. And I think the beauty of this is, through this, it teaches us the power of storytelling. In a way, we know that when we look at the NDIS and when we talk about the NDIS, it's very easy for us to talk about the numbers, how many people, how many Australians are living on the NDIS right now, and how many people it's impacted, and the money that's been spent in this National Disability Insurance Scheme. But I think what we often, or what we probably should remember more, is that behind every piece of data, behind every number is a story, and behind that story is a human. And when you leverage that, and I think the NDIS is a perfect foundation, that it's already built a perfect foundation for us to start creating these stories. And it's now a matter of us. It's up to us to amplify and elevate these stories and these voices.
Mari, do you think we've lost that? Do you think we've sort of maybe taken our eye off the fact that behind the numbers, as Mel said, there's a human being, and there's a, as Bruce said, one of us. It might be ourselves, it might be our family, it might be our friends. Is that one of the ways that over the next 10 years, is that one of the first remarkable insights as a sector we have to come together to co-design and tell the story a bit better?
Yes, I think so. Obviously, the numbers are critically important, but you can get lost in the numbers. And what the NDIS does is really bring together human potential in a way that possibly hasn't been done before, and really unlocks that potential. So that's where I see the story perhaps needing a little bit of a job, needing to step up a bit. Those numbers will always be there, but the numbers don't in itself tell the story, So we can talk about the commercial opportunities and the innovation, but this is really disruptive innovation driven by inclusion, right? And that unlocks human potential. So I think that's a story. It was very, very powerful in the beginning, and Bruce and many others did an awesome job in telling that story. And I just think we need to keep that story front and centre.
Bruce, love to hear your thoughts, and also maybe the role that data plays in, how do we harness the data to tell the right story? And maybe that, you can tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing today.
Look, I think data tells the story, but people tell their stories with even more power. And, one of the things that I've been reflecting on as we've just been talking is that when we were campaigning for the NDIS, every Australian Council told the story of why the scheme was needed in a way that resonated with the Australian community, so that when the Gillard government announced that it was going to have to increase taxes in order to fund the NDIS, 85% of the Australian community supported the introduction of the scheme and the tax increase. So never before has a tax increase been welcomed by the Australian community as it was then. But what is striking is that the stories of the great successes that are happening within the NDIS are not getting out and resonating in the same way, or alternatively, the stories that are there where people are, struggling with the NDIS and some of its complexity are drowning out those positive stories. And so I think we really do need to go back to that to individual stories, because they're that's the real ambassadorial function that needs to be performed here. And so that's one aspect. I think the second thing is that when I think about physical infrastructure, when governments announce they're going to build a new bridge or a new tunnel, our political leaders are very keen to don lycra and hard hats, you know, as a sign, you know, of the way they are bonding with the people that are actually going to deliver the project, right? But when have our political leaders, you know, donned the clothing that support workers wear every day when they're out in the community, when they're supporting an individual, to identify that they, you know, to show that they identify with them? And when that happens, we'll know that we have certainly won. But we, you know, I think we've got a way to go. But that's the key to acceptance, that this is great work that people are doing. So support workers do great work, but that affiliation isn't there today, and that's what we need.
So Bruce, is that one of the remarkable insights for us tonight when we think as a sector of you know, how we come together over the next couple of years? Is that one of the angles we should be thinking about, getting our politicians to spend more time with people with disabilities? We know the representation of people with disabilities at the highest levels in government and sort of the corporate world isn't good enough. Is that one of the ways that we can encourage our politicians to be spending more time with support workers and the people they support?
Absolutely. You know, when they are the cover pictures on our papers, we'll know that we have really moved public opinion, because it will show that this work is recognised and valued in a way that is not there today, and that the people who are being supported through that work are also valued. As you know, that's part of citizenship. You know, I think, you know, we've seen in many situations, you know, where people, you know, if we think about the whole history of disability and the way people with disabilities were hidden away in large institutions, you know, they're now out and about in the community. But, you know, when they're not only out and about in the community, but are very regularly on the front pages of our papers, when they're very regularly featured in films and movies and theatre and so on, you know, that's when we've got true inclusion, true acceptance, true recognition of diversity.
And that's one of the great, someone once said to me, one of the great hidden things about the NDIS is that, yes, it's about more money and it's about choice and control, but fundamentally it changes power dynamics, and it changes the way that organisations and communities relate to people with disabilities and their families. Treating people more as customers, you know, in the mainstream is a fantastic thing. Mel, I want to go on to talk about what are some of the big opportunities, but to Bruce's point there, from a political perspective, the NDIS is supposed to be one of the big job, if not the big job drivers over the next 10 years. I think the Minister talks about driving 90,000 full-time equivalent jobs. And so, Mel, I'd just love to hear your thoughts on, you know, as a segue into our discussion about the opportunities of the NDIS. Should we be making more about the job creation that will come along with the NDIS?
I think there's a massive opportunity there, whether it's for job opportunities or for education or all facets of everyday life that we all need as humans. I think one of the examples of this, and it's again touching on your point, Bruce and Geordie, about what you mentioned earlier around the importance of having the voices of people with disability and lived experience at the forefront of all these changes. And that's when we know opportunities are created and talent is discovered, which it's insane to think about it, because as an example, one of the summits that was recently hosted by the Children and Young People with Disability Australia, we hosted a 5-day virtual summit, one of Australia's first completely youth-led, youth-designed and developed and disability-focused summit. And that is just a testament of, first of all, the role of technology and how that plays, and how that is, how technology has a power to bring over the voices of over 200 people, young people with disability all over the country, to together at a summit to discuss the challenges of navigating the disability sector and also the opportunities and how these challenges have been turned into opportunities and as a driving force for innovation. And it's also just, I think, a testament of what it's like, the impact of having the voices of young people and a platform for these voices to be elevated and amplified.
Mel, I agree entirely. We're living in a time where the technology makes the constituent representation and storytelling more available than ever. And I think that's a huge piece. Murray, I wanted to hear from you and Mel about the opportunities of technology and especially assistive technology. Give us a bit of a picture of what that looks like in Australia and the potential over the next 10 years for Australia in assistive technology.
Should Mel continue, or do you want me to speak?
I'd love both of you to reflect on that question as sort of technologists and designers. I'd love for both of you to think about sort of what that opportunity is. Murray, maybe if you set the scene for us in terms of the role of assistive tech over the next couple of years.
So a number of years back, the NDIS did an assessment of the size of the AT market to be about $1 billion a year. Some of the work that I've been doing, and when you look at the Productivity Commission work in human servicing more broadly, it's not hard to make that number 4 billion. And if you think about over 10 years, that's 40 billion. So to Bruce's reflection earlier about physical infrastructure, there's a lot of excitement about the submarine projects, right? Which is like a $50 billion project. But we don't build submarines all the time. I mean, that project will come to an end. But this is potentially $40 billion just in Australia over 10 years, and that will keep going on. So I just sort of call out to everybody, how can you get excited about $40 billion over 10 years ongoing? And so, this is really applying, obviously what we all call exponential thinking, 10x thinking to this. So as part of this assistive technology opportunity, in particular, I'll talk about it a bit later, is the absolute revolution in gaming platforms and how gaming platforms are being used in therapy and in education. So I just call out to everybody, 40 billion over 10 years. Put your superannuation on it because you might need it. But that is a massive number, and it's real. I guess the challenge is there's not a submarine next to it, but you should get just as excited because that's ongoing. So that's my call out.
Mel, as a designer and a technologist, but especially having worked in startups over the last couple of years, what do you see as the opportunity for, be it assistive technology startups or any other startups, platforms, or anything else in the sector? What do you think in terms of the next couple of years? If we do have, in terms of the audience tonight, we do have startup founders and investors and that sort of thing sort of tuning in. So what would you say is the opportunity to those people, Mel?
It's a great question. I think at the moment, it's sort of, if you refer this to a puzzle piece, we sort of have the different puzzle pieces. We've identified these pieces. We know that we need to work towards a society that's more inclusive and more diverse. And right now, we are in, more than ever, we're placed in the most unique position to do that. Because I think right now, especially in a global pandemic, we can either have a conversation around recovery to try and go back to what was normal, per se, or we can have a conversation about rebuild and talk about how we can leverage this unique opportunity to reframe and redefine inclusion and diversity, and how each of us as individuals and as organizations and as startups can contribute to this. And I think we know for a fact that products and services are much more powerful and much more better when it's designed and developed with a diverse and unique perspective. And we know for the fact that the NDIS will be a main driver behind this. And we also know that people with a disability have the desire and the ability to create this social change by leveraging our own unique perspectives. And we also know that there are organizations right now, like we are now, Remarkable, and all the initiatives that we have right now, we know that these are opportunities to create a platform for this to happen. But I think now it's also time for us to look at how we can put these puzzle pieces together, because none of these elements will be enough unless it's working together. And now that we've identified these puzzle pieces, I think the roadmap to inclusion from here onwards and our conversation about rebuilding is about how we can start piecing these puzzle pieces together and see it more from a holistic perspective, because each of these elements will be much, much more powerful when it's combined.
Yeah, I love that, Mel, and I love thinking about rather than just recovery, thinking about rebuilding through, looking at COVID is obviously a devastating, dreadful thing that's happened this year, but to think about these two things coming together, the opportunity of the NDIS with an opportunity to build back better. I think that might be Biden's campaign, but the opportunity to rebuild in more inclusive ways, I think is fantastic. I might just to pause the conversation quickly, just to say to our viewers, please submit your questions. We'll be going to questions in the next couple of minutes. So please think about any questions you'd like me to ask the panelists. Bruce, I'd love to just, you and I were speaking recently about universal design, and I'd love for you to just sort of reflect on the opportunity beyond the disability sector, with all the opportunity for great design and great technology and investment and those sorts of things. But I'd love for you to just reflect on the power of universal design and the way that maybe we can take the rest of the country along with us by thinking more of this as universal design, not just for our sector.
Yeah. So I think, one of the, I think, really important things that we're now seeing, particularly with mainstream technology, is that it is really being built to universal design principles. And that's not because of the power of people with disabilities particularly, but it's because people without disabilities want to use these devices, their phones, their iPads, and whatever they are, when they can't see them and when they can't touch them and when they can't hear them and when they can't, and so they're being built to assist every person in every situation. And so that, of course, is incredibly important for people with disabilities, because it means they're designed for them as well. And so what I think mainstream technology is displaying is that when you design for disability, you design for all. But in the process, what you do is you create a platform on which all sorts of things, apps and other things, can be built, which are then specific for people with disability, but they're affordable because they've got all the economies of scale of the iPhone and the iPad and all the other devices that are sort of commonly available. And so, I think about a friend of one of my sons who used to have because he can't speak, he had a voice synthesizer that used to cost $5,000. He's now got an iPad that can do the same thing, but in which he can also read books, watch movies, and message friends and family. And it's a cool device rather than a very odd-looking device that sits on his wheelchair. And so I think universal design provides an extraordinary platform on which we can build all sorts of solutions to support people with disabilities. But we can only do that successfully if we incorporate people with disabilities into that design. So, I think what Mel has said is just so right. I think the other thing that's really significant here is that with the NDIS, this is the only disability scheme in the world which is totally driven by control and choice. So when people come up with a great idea, consumers can purchase it. It's not a case, you know, in the old world, services were block funded by governments. And so it was governments that decided which services were supported. Here you can be creative in the way that Mari has indicated, and you can get rewarded in the marketplace. I mean, that at the end of the day, that's what's driven the success of Hire Up. You know, that you had a product and people came and they bought it. They didn't have, it wasn't intermediated through government. But I think the other thing that we should focus on here is the potential for Australia to be a test bed for some of these great innovative ideas, partly because people have got control and choice. But the other thing is that the NDIS is collecting the best data on disability anywhere in the world. Data on functional impairments, on support needs, on outcomes. And so you can link the significance of your innovations to outcomes here and lead in a way that you could not do in any other country. So for the entrepreneurs and the investors, this is a great country to come to at this time if you're interested in supporting, in developing ideas that better support people with disabilities.
Fantastic, Bruce. And do you think that's one of the ways that we could, over the next 10 years, be thinking about taking the story of the NDIS? There are, you know, I know in my network, there are, with friends that are sort of wanting to get involved in startups, heaps of accelerators outside of the disability sector for great ideas. Should we be going and talking to some of these startups that are designing products to consider people with disabilities, given the size of the market and the applicability of the sort of technology that they're building?
Absolutely. And, you know, if we want to set, you know, a benchmark for success, it will be, you know, how many of the great disability startups in the world, you know, originated in Australia in 10 years' time. You know, how many started here? How many people came here because they wanted to test their ideas here? That'll be one of the ways we can say, look, we have been, you know, we have really realised the potential of the NDIS to change the lives of people with disability, not just in Australia then, but globally.
Fascinating. Mario, I'd love to go to you to maybe talk to us a little bit about the sort of the exponential time that we're living in when it comes to technology, and what you see sort of over the next 10 years are some of the, maybe if we call them the sort of large trends in terms of technology that's going to play out through the disability sector and beyond.
Definitely AI. I mean, we were the really vanguards when we were doing Nadia. So it's AI and also gaming platforms. So these together, I think, are really changing the face, literally, and the shape of computing. But when we talk about technologies, I just pick up Bruce Enmill's point. This is about inclusive action. So people with disability who are entrepreneurs and technologists actually push the boundaries of what's possible and even what they imagine. So this would be, I'd say, it's a bit like the introduction of SMS, you know, into Australia a number of years ago, was driven by the intervention of the Human Rights Commission, so that people with hearing impairments and their families could benefit from the introduction of mobile technologies. So over the next 10 years, the rise and rapid take-up of gaming platforms is going to be really a benchmark. Already we see Microsoft is saying that there's 3 billion people that are gamers worldwide. We know that gaming platforms are beyond entertainment, but are being used in therapeutic settings, including for monitoring for signs of PTSD in service veterans, in education, and in Alzheimer's. So to Bruce's point, universal design means that these type of innovations become mainstream, and these particular innovations, gaming, and if you like, AI-powered avatars, really improve capacity building. And there's therapeutic benefits of these applications, and this has been peer-reviewed, and the benefits are phenomenal. So I would sort of say next 10 years, gaming and AI-powered avatars is literally changing the face of computing.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff, Murray. Just one more shout out. We're fast running out of time. So if you've got any questions for the panelists, please do send those through. There's a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Send us through any questions. Murray, just before I move on, you've spent a bit of time in the US, and I guess I just wanted to sort of get your thoughts on, do we think big enough? As we think about the opportunity in Australia, we think about some of the sort of technological trends that are coming. Do we need to step up our thinking? Do we need to be a bit braver and a bit bolder in the way that we think?
You know, there's phenomenal thinking that is done in Australia. It's what happens next I think is the challenge. And the work that I've been doing in the United States and elsewhere around the world, what we started in the NDIS, particularly like with the likes of Nadia, but also the thinking about more broadly assistive technology, that is taking off around the world. And so there's not a shortage of good ideas in Australia, but I think we need to catalyse the ecosystem, because that brings confidence to people. So whereas the US market is quite big, and it's not difficult to get people around, you know, an out there idea and build confidence. The Australian market isn't as big. So that's where I think telling the stories of the greatest nation building project on earth is so important, because it gives people confidence, and it gives people the confidence to try. And I have got every confidence that the work that we started and the work that is still happening will literally change lives. It'll change my daughter's life. It'll change my grandson's life. I'll just put it out there for people. I'm passionate about this because it matters, right? It matters. So is that enough?
No, it's fantastic.
You know?
Mel, we've got a comment. I think it's a comment from I think it's Rosalind, who said, "Thanks, Mel. Just looked up the stats. She said 391,999 Australians are accessing the NDIS. 8,200 children receiving support through the early childhood intervention approach." She said, "Yes, each individual person has their own human potential." I think just Murray, as you say there, when we think about the numbers of people, there's 400,000 people on the scheme. This is really life-changing stuff. Bruce, maybe this one is for you. This looks like it's from Amir, I believe. It says, "We're 5 years in and still the budget utilisation is less than 70%. What is the main reason we cannot fully utilise the committed budget?" Bruce, maybe you can sort of enlighten us on that one.
Just before I answer that question, just in relation to the 400,000 in the scheme, I think the other very important statistic is that 175,000 of them, so nearly one half, did not receive any supports before the introduction of the NDIS. So that gives some sense of how much difference this scheme is making. But to answer the question about utilisation, it is one of the great great conundrums of the scheme, because when we started, we expected that utilisation would be about 95%, and it's never risen above 70% or thereabouts since we started. I mean, what we know is that over time, people's utilisations tend to rise. As they become familiar with the NDIS, as they become familiar with the packages, they tend to spend more. We know that or we think that support coordination has a role to play in assisting people with utilising their packages well. It's clear from the statistics that utilisation is lower the further you move away from metropolitan areas to rural and remote areas. So thin markets would appear to be contributing to this. But overall, it still remains a puzzle. And in fact, one of the projects we're currently undertaking at the Melbourne Disability Institute is to look at plan utilisation and to try and get a deeper understanding about what's driving it and what's inhibiting people. I think one of the things that is pretty clear is that choosing NDIS services, and more broadly choosing human services, requires a lot of due diligence, a lot of careful thought and choice, and so as an economist, what I would say is that the transaction costs associated with that are very high. You know, it takes a lot to move from one service provider to another. And so one of the, I think, big questions for us going forward is how can technology assist with that? How can it assist with providing people with reliable and timely and accessible information? How can it make those switches easier? You know, for example, in banking, you know, there's now plans to enable people to take their bank account numbers from one bank to another, precisely because not being able to do that inhibits people, or largely prevents people from switching banks, even if the service and the pricing might be better at another bank. And so I think we need to think more about what the enablers are that will facilitate people being able to spend their packages in ways that deliver good results for them, and in ways.
Oh, sorry, Bruce.
Yeah, yeah, and in ways that minimize the transaction costs, because the transaction costs involve time and effort, and you know, we want to try and make that process as easy as possible. But I think the final point I just want to make is that the real marker of success is not utilization. The real marker of success is whether the NDIS is changing people's lives for the better. We've actually done looked at utilisation rates or utilisation in schemes, in other consumer-driven schemes around the world, and nowhere in the world does anyone set the utilisation rate as the goal. The goal has got to be better lives, and we need to hold on to that and remember that as we think about this issue.
And maybe, Bruce, that's sort of symptomatic of where we've got to, that we're maybe focusing on some of the wrong questions when we should be thinking about the opportunity to get utilisation up, of course, but then what are the ways that we can enable sort of for, you know, great participation in the scheme. Mel, I'm going to throw to you for the last question. We've got some great questions coming in now. I'm also aware of time. I have a habit of running horribly over time whenever I talk, so I'm being held to the clock tonight, I'm afraid. But Mel, just in terms of the National Disability Strategy that's being looked at now, consultations are happening now as we think about how can the overarching National Disability Strategy contribute to the next 10 years and the success of the NDIS. Mel, the question from Ren says, how can the National Disability Strategy in the next phase promote greater jobs and universal design for people with disabilities? I might get your thoughts quickly on that, Mel, and then we'll go to wrap up.
Yeah, I think, first of all, it will start with co-design and collaboration. I think that's the first and foremost principle that we all need to work towards and also practice. And I think with that comes with curiosity. And I think curiosity leads to understanding, and understanding leads to learning. And when you learn, you'll start to see the impact of it and the impact of bringing unique perspectives together. And I think one of the greatest examples is that, even just as an example of work from home, right now, all of us, it's no longer just about who can and who can't, or who should and shouldn't work from home. We are all in the same boat right now, but that is also an example of how a challenge can drive us to think in an innovative way, creatively, but also force us to be flexible and adaptable, which is essentially what we need to work towards. We need to work towards a society that isn't just built as a one-size-fits-all. It isn't just built for what is seen or as defined as the social norm. It needs to have the flexibility, the agility, and the adaptability to move with us as we, as a society, continue to grow and look forward. And I think the National Disability Strategy has a great way and it's in a very powerful and unique position to drive that line of thinking and that approach.
Mel, maybe a leading question, but I'm sure you'd encourage everyone across the sector to really embrace the opportunity to have their voices heard through the NDIS, especially young people with disabilities. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. I cannot stress enough the impact and the outcomes that you will achieve from having. And I think it's very easy to fall into the perception of the consultation, as in we will develop a service or a product and then we will consult the end users. And then that's almost like a seen as a compliance task that we do as a final step before we hit launch. And we really need to reframe that. And you will see the magical moment that occurs when you start bringing these voices from the very start. And in fact, for products and services to be driven by these voices, that's when you will truly see the difference and also truly be able to embrace inclusion and diversity.
Fantastic. Everyone, thank you so much for the contribution this evening. We're a little bit over time now. I apologise to the remarkable team. There's some fantastic questions coming in, which is brilliant to see. I'd love to think that maybe we can continue the discussion afterwards on socials. That's on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. The hashtag is Remarkable Insights, I believe, and it's Remarkable Tech. Would love to take some of the questions that haven't been answered tonight and throw them on socials. And I'm sure Mari, Mel, Bruce, and I can keep an eye on those and maybe interact offline. The last question that was asked earlier that I thought I might just address, an interesting question from Jonathan. Why is Remarkable funded primarily by iCare corporates and government? If disability innovation is truly to be appreciated by the public, don't we actually need everyday people to appreciate the value of inclusion and allow members of the general public to co-invest to enable them to appreciate the value of inclusion? I think that's a brilliant question. And I won't speak, well, I will speak on behalf of the Remarkable team to say, I think some of the wonderful supporters of the program that have got things up and running would be delighted to see the progress it's made. I think that's what Remarkable is all about, allowing people the opportunities to, if you've got a great idea, to bring that to the public and get support for that and allow all sorts of people to invest in great ideas. So I think maybe Remarkable is just the start of something really special in terms of the innovation ecosystem over the next couple of years. But again, Jonathan, great question, and maybe one better directed to Pete, who actually is the official spokesperson for Remarkable. We're going to wrap up now, everybody. As I said, please, if you've got more questions, jump onto the social channels and keep the conversation going. I'd like to say a huge thank you to our panelists, Mel Tran, Murray Johnson, and Bruce Bonyhady. Guys, thank you so much for your time this evening. It's been a really, really excellent conversation. To our Auslan interpreter, Chelsea Turner, thank you so much for your time with us this evening, and to the Remarkable team for all the work you do, and the Cerebral Palsy Alliance. Thank you so much. This has been my first ever moderation. I've loved it. And so maybe we'll start a impromptu poll. If you think I've done a better job than Pete Horsley, let us know on the social channels, and I might even get a shot to come back and host another. As I said, my name's Jordan O'Reilly, the CEO of Higher Up. If you're interested in our work, jump onto the socials. It's Higher Up Australia, or onto the website. It's higherup.com.au. As a call to action, just remember that Remarkable is all about harnessing technology to build the social, economic inclusion of people with disabilities in Australia. If you or someone you know is solving a wonderful a problem in sort of interesting and wonderful ways in the ageing or disability sectors, Remarkable would love to support you on the journey. We'll be seeking your feedback off the back of this survey, off the back of this webinar. So please do take time to fill out the survey. This recording will be available on the YouTube channel which is Remarkable Tech on YouTube. And as a final thought, this conversation is just so vital over the next 10 years, really vital that we continue to have it and to push out some of these remarkable insights in the way that we've discussed this evening. Thank you again for participating, for tuning in tonight. Thank you to our panelists, and we'll see you next time. Good night.